You really think a broke rancher in some widow's charity case is going to make it through winter? Garrett Sloane's voice cut across the feed store like a whip crack, loud enough that every man in the room stopped moving. He didn't bother lowering it. He wanted it heard. He turned just enough to make sure Rowan could see the smile on his face, the kind that wasn't a smile at all. I give it 6 weeks before those kids are crying in the snow and you're begging at my gate. Rowan's jaw tightened. His hand stayed flat on the counter. He didn't move, didn't speak. Because what Sloane didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the woman standing in his kitchen that morning had already done something no hired hand ever had. She'd made the place feel like a home again. Before we go any further, if stories about real people fighting impossible odds speak to something in you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. I don't want you to miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The notice had been up for 3 weeks before Rowan Mercer finally admitted to himself that no one was coming. He'd tacked it to the board outside Callaway's general store on a Tuesday morning in late September, written in the plain, blocky letters of a man who didn't believe in wasting words. Cook needed. Blackstone Ridge, room and board, no drinkers, no trouble. He hadn't even put his name on it. Anyone in Clearwater Valley who didn't already know where Blackstone Ridge was had no business applying. That first week, he'd checked the board twice on his supply runs. The notice stayed exactly where he'd left it, untouched, its bottom edge starting to curl from the morning damp. By the second week, he stopped looking. By the third, he'd already started mentally calculating how much canned goods he could stretch through April if he rationed hard enough and didn't break a leg or get sick. It wasn't a plan. It was a last resort dressed up to look like one. Rowan was 46 years old, though most people who met him figured closer to 55. Not because he looked particularly weathered. He did, but that wasn't it. It was something in the way he moved, deliberate. Like a man who had learned the hard way that rushing toward anything usually meant arriving to find it already gone. He had a ranch of 400 acres northeast of Clearwater, a herd of cattle that had shrunk from 93 head to 61 over the last 2 years, a barn with a roof that needed replacing before the first serious snow, and a house that had not had a warm meal cooked in it since the spring of the year before last. His wife, Clara, had died of pneumonia. His daughter, May, had gone to live with Clara's sister in Colorado because Rowan, in a moment of grief-stunned honesty, had told the girl's aunt that he couldn't promise to take care of her right. He told himself it was temporary. That was 14 months ago. May still wrote letters. Rowan wrote back. Neither of them talked about when she was coming home because neither of them was sure she was. So when the battered wagon rolled through his gate on a Thursday afternoon in early October, Rowan was in the middle of rehanging a fence gate that had been dragging mud all season. He heard the wagon before he saw it. The axle on the left rear wheel had a squeal to it that could have woken the dead, and the horse pulling it, a brown and gray mare that had clearly been ridden hard for a long time, moved with the careful, plodding patience of an animal that had learned not to expect anything easy. Rowan straightened up, set down his hammer, and watched. The wagon pulled to a stop about 20 yards from where he stood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver set the brake, wrapped the reins, and climbed down. And Rowan realized with a start that the driver was a woman. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, though tiredness had added years to her face that didn't belong there yet. She had dark hair pulled back without much ceremony, a coat that had seen better decades, and the kind of posture that comes not from pride, but from habit. The posture of someone who had gotten used to being the tallest person in the room, even when she was sitting down. She dusted her hands on her coat and looked at him directly. "Blackstone Ridge?" she said. "That's right. You posted for a cook." It wasn't a question exactly. More like she was confirming she was in the right place before she invested any more energy in the conversation. Rowan said yes. She nodded once, like that settled something, and then turned back to the wagon and said something too quiet for him to catch. 3 children climbed down. Rowan felt something shift behind his sternum. Not pain, nothing so clean as that. More like the particular feeling of a man who has carefully arranged his life around a specific amount of emptiness and suddenly finds the measurements have changed. The oldest was a boy, maybe 13 or 14, who landed on the ground with the unconscious competence of someone already used to doing the physical work of moving through the world. He immediately went to check the horse's left foreleg without being asked, crouching down and running his hand along the joint in a way that was professional enough that Rowan noticed it. The second child was a girl, maybe 10, who stood with her arms folded tight across her chest and studied the ranch with a measuring expression that reminded Rowan uncomfortably of himself at that age. And the youngest, a boy of perhaps 5 or 6, landed in the dirt, looked around at everything with enormous brown eyes, and then looked up at his mother and said, "Is this the place?" "Might be," the woman said. "We'll see." Then she looked back at Rowan. "I'm Naomi Barrett," she said. "This is Eli, Hazel, and Finn." She said each name with a small gesture, like she was introducing them to someone at a dinner party and not standing in a dirt yard at the edge of the Wyoming frontier. "I cook, I preserve. I can do livestock basics, feed, water, basic tending. My son Eli can work cattle. He's better than he looks." Eli, who was currently still examining the mare's leg and hadn't looked up, said, "Her fetlock's swollen. She needs rest and a poultice." Rowan looked at the boy, then back at the woman. "I posted for a cook," he said carefully, "not a family." Something moved across Naomi Barrett's face. Not offense, not desperation either. Something quieter and harder to name. The look of a woman who has already decided how this conversation is going to go and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "I know what you posted," she said, "and I can do the work. Better than most, and I'll prove that inside of a week if you give me the chance." She paused. "But I need you to understand something before we go any further. My children go where I go. They work when there's work to do. They eat what we all eat. They stay in whatever space you've got. That's not negotiable." Another pause, shorter this time. "We come together or we don't come at all. That's the only condition I have." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who trusted his instincts about people. He'd had to be, out here, and his instincts were currently giving him a complicated and contradictory set of signals that he didn't particularly enjoy. He looked at the 3 children, the boy still crouched by the horse, the girl watching him with those measuring eyes, the little one now studying something in the dirt with complete concentration, as though a pebble required his full scientific attention. "I'm not set up for children," Rowan said. "We'll manage," Naomi said. "There's only one spare room. We've slept in tighter quarters." He almost said, "I don't want another family in this house." He almost said it out loud, because it was the truest thing in him at that moment, and he'd learned, at great cost, that not saying the true thing usually made everything worse in the end. But he looked at the little boy, Finn, who had picked up the pebble now and was turning it over in his palm with the reverent concentration of someone who believed it might be something extraordinary, and the words didn't come out. What came out instead was, "There's a pump behind the barn. Horse should drink and rest before you do anything else with her." Naomi held his gaze for a half-second longer than necessary. Then she said, "Thank you." It wasn't victory in her voice. It wasn't relief either. It was just acknowledgement, the same tone you'd use to confirm directions. And Rowan found, to his own deep discomfort, that he respected that more than he wanted to. That night, he lay awake and stared at the ceiling and thought about all the ways this was going to be a catastrophic mistake. The ranch was already running thin. He'd done the numbers enough times to know them by heart. If the winter ran long, if he lost more cattle to cold or predators, if the roof let water through in the wrong place at the wrong time, he was looking at a spring that would start in the red and dig deeper from there. Adding 3 children to his supplies wasn't a kindness. It was arithmetic he couldn't afford. And yet, he thought about the way Eli had gone straight to that horse without being told. He thought about the measuring look in the girl's eyes. He thought about Finn and the pebble. And he thought about Naomi Barrett standing in a dirt yard at the edge of his failing ranch, exhausted down to the bone, and offering him nothing but work and one single condition that she wouldn't budge on. He'd known desperate people who were desperate in the clinging way, the way that looked for something to hold on to and didn't let go. She hadn't felt like that. She'd felt like a woman who'd made her peace with leaving if leaving was what it came to. He didn't sleep much. The next morning, Rowan came downstairs before first light, the way he always did, expecting to find the cold kitchen and the dull, familiar ritual of making coffee over a fire that never quite heated the room properly. Instead, he walked into the smell of something that stopped him in the doorway. Naomi was already at the stove. She had clearly been up for at least an hour. The fire was properly built, hotter than he ever managed to get it in the mornings, with the damper adjusted in a way he kept meaning to figure out and never had. There was coffee already made, and something in the cast iron skillet that he couldn't immediately identify, but that smelled like Sunday mornings, like a house where someone actually lived. He stood in the doorway longer than was dignified. She didn't turn around. "Coffee's ready," she said. "Eggs will be a few minutes. I found some dried herbs in the back of the second cabinet. I hope that's all right. The label said they were Clara's." She said the name simply, not carefully. Not the way people usually said his wife's name around him, with that practiced gentleness that always felt like being handled. Just as a fact. The herbs had a label. The label had a name. Rowan sat down at the kitchen table, which was something he hadn't done in the morning in a very long time. He usually took his coffee standing at the counter and left before the silence of the kitchen could settle into him. "It's fine," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She put a plate in front of him a few minutes later. Eggs with the dried herbs, biscuits that she must have started the night before, and a piece of dried pork from his stores, sliced thin and crisped in the pan. The way he liked it, but had never quite managed to replicate on his own. He ate. She moved around the kitchen with an efficiency that wasn't showy. The efficiency of someone who had done a great deal with very little for long enough that it had become natural. She didn't make conversation. She didn't need the room to acknowledge her. He was halfway through the plate before he realized something. The kitchen didn't feel empty. It was the first time in 14 months he'd sat in this room and not felt the specific weight of everything that wasn't there anymore. He didn't say anything about it. He wasn't built for saying things like that. But when he stood to leave, he paused at the door and said, without turning around, "Eli, if he wants to come out with me this morning, he can. If not, there's wood that needs splitting behind the north side of the barn." A pause. Then Naomi's voice, even and quiet. "He'll be out in 10 minutes. Eli was out in 8. The first real trouble came 4 days in, and it came from the direction Rowan had expected it to come from, which didn't make it any easier to deal with. Garrett Sloan owned the largest ranch in Clearwater Valley, the kind of large that came from 3 generations of aggressive land buying, and a talent for knowing exactly when a neighbor was desperate enough to sell low. He was 58, broad through the shoulders, and had a way of filling a room not with presence exactly, but with the certainty that his opinions on any given subject were the most important ones in it. He'd never liked Rowan much, which was mutual, but they'd maintained the kind of careful distance that passes for civility on the frontier. Rowan saw Sloane's horse tied outside Calloway's when he rode in for supplies that Friday, and he thought about coming back later. Then he thought about the fact that he'd spent 14 months adjusting his life around avoiding discomfort, and he went in. Sloane was at the counter when Rowan came through the door. He had 2 other men with him, Decker and Marsh, smaller ranchers who tended to orbit Sloane's gravity the way that certain men orbit anyone who seems confident enough to know what's coming next. Sloane looked at Rowan, and something sharpened in his expression that Rowan didn't like. "Heard you got yourself a cook," Sloane said. "That's right." "Heard it's a widow, with kids." He said it the way someone might say, "Heard you bought a horse with 3 legs." Rowan set his list on the counter in front of Calloway and didn't look at Sloane. "She cooks," he said. "That's what I needed." "You needed a cook," Sloane said, "not 3 extra mouths to feed through a Wyoming winter." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had gotten louder. Not angry, but pitched for the room, the way a man talks when he wants witnesses. "I'm not saying it's not generous, Mercer. I'm saying generous is a fine thing when you can afford it. You can't afford it." The room had gone quiet. Calloway was very busy with his inventory. Rowan kept his voice level. "My ranch, my business." "Your ranch," Sloane agreed pleasantly. "And when you run short of feed by February and you're watching your cattle drop, and that widow's children are eating what your herd needed, that's your business too, I suppose." He picked up the package Calloway had put together for him. "Some men learn the hard way what sentiment costs out here. I'd hate to watch that happen to you." He said it kindly. That was the thing about Sloane. He always said the cruelest things in the most reasonable voice, as though he were simply offering information that you had unfortunately failed to gather yourself. Rowan turned and looked at him then. He let the silence stretch for a beat longer than comfortable. "I'll keep that in mind," he said finally. Sloane held his gaze for a moment, then smiled, that not smile, and walked past him out the door. Decker and Marsh followed in his wake without quite meeting Rowan's eyes. Calloway began filling Rowan's order in careful silence. Rowan stood at the counter and said nothing, but his hand on the wood was flat and very still. The way a man holds himself still when moving would mean moving towards something he can't afford to reach for. He didn't tell Naomi what Sloane had said. He didn't see the point. But 2 days later, she told him something instead. She was sitting at the kitchen table after supper, doing mending by the lamp, and the children were in the back room. The sound of Finn's voice carried through the door. He was telling some elaborate story that involved, as far as Rowan could make out, a dragon who had lost his best boot. Hazel's occasional dry commentary kept interrupting. Eli said almost nothing, but once in a while he made a sound that might have been a laugh. Rowan was at the table too, looking at the account books, which was to say, looking at the numbers, and then looking at the ceiling, and then looking at the numbers again. Naomi threaded a needle without looking up. "You've got about 6 weeks of flour at the current rate," she said. "Maybe 8 if we stretch the biscuits and switch to cornbread twice a week." He looked at her. "You've been going through my stores." "I'm your cook," she said. "It's my job to know what you have and how long it'll last." She tied off a knot, cut the thread. "You've also got less salt pork than you think. Someone stored it wrong, so the second crate is starting to turn. You need to use that first." Rowan put the pen down. He looked at her for a moment. "How long ago did your husband die?" The mending paused, just for a second. 2 years in January, she said. "What happened?" She looked up then. Not defensive, just evaluating whether he was asking to be polite or asking because he actually wanted to know. Apparently she decided it was the second thing. "Fever," she said. "Same thing every season, and every season most people shake it off." He didn't. A beat. He was a good man. He just wasn't a sturdy one. "Where were you?" "Kansas. We had a small farm." She picked up another piece of mending, Finn's shirt by the size of it, and the tear was spectacular. "It wasn't much, but it was ours. After Thomas died, I found out we owed more on it than it was worth. The bank was patient for about 8 months, and then it wasn't." She said it without rancor, the tone of someone who has made their peace with a fact by looking at it straight enough times that it no longer had the power to surprise them. "So we left." Rowan thought about the battered wagon and the squealing axle and the mare with the swollen fetlock. "You drove from Kansas?" "In stages. We stopped where there was work." She looked at him levelly. "Before you ask, yes, this is the furthest we've come. And yes, I know Wyoming winters are serious. I didn't come here not knowing that." "Why did you come here then?" She was quiet for a moment. In the back room, Finn's dragon had apparently found the boot, but was now having a disagreement with a talking river about who the boot belonged to. Hazel's commentary had become somewhat pointed. "Because there was work here," Naomi said finally, "and because I needed to get somewhere I could stop moving." She looked down at the mending. "My children have been sleeping in that wagon for 6 weeks. Finn thinks it's an adventure. Hazel knows better and is too tired to pretend it isn't. Eli hasn't complained once, which is worse than if he had." She paused. "I needed them to have a floor under them for a winter." The room was quiet except for the fire and the muffled theater of Finn's dragon saga. Rowan looked at the account books. He thought about Sloane's voice in the feed store, carrying the way it was meant to. He thought about the numbers on the page in front of him, which were real and unforgiving and had nothing personal against him. They were just what they were. "The flour situation," he said. "If I pick up another 50 pounds on my next run—" "60, Naomi said. "And lard. We're lower on lard than you think." "60, he said. "And lard." He wrote it down. "The salt pork. Can anything be salvaged?" "Some of it. I'll go through it tomorrow and tell you what's worth keeping." He nodded. He picked up his pen. He looked at the numbers again, and they were still the same numbers they'd been 20 minutes ago, but somehow they felt like a problem that could be worked on rather than a wall that couldn't be moved. He didn't examine why that was. Some things you understood better by not looking directly at them. The first time Eli saved him actual money, Rowan almost didn't notice it happening. They were out checking the east fence line, a job that usually took Rowan most of a day, and produced the particular grinding fatigue of work that was always urgent and never finished. Eli had been coming out with him every morning for a week by then, mostly quiet, learning the land by watching rather than asking. He had a good eye, the boy. He noticed things. They came to a stretch of fence near the creek where the posts had been heaving from the freeze-thaw, and Rowan started calculating in his head what it would take to reset them. Probably 2 days' work, post driver, probably lose a day to weather somewhere in there. Eli walked along the line slowly, his hands in his pockets, not touching anything. Then he stopped. "The posts aren't the problem," he said. Rowan looked at him. "The creek shifted," Eli said. "See where the bank is? The water's been cutting toward the fence line. You reset the posts and it'll just happen again next spring." He crouched down, looking at the angle of the erosion. "If you redirect the flow here, bring in some rock, change where the water wants to go, the fence holds itself." Rowan crouched beside him and looked at the bank. He looked at it for a long time. The boy was right. Rowan had been out here for 9 years and had never noticed the creek moving. Eli Barrett had been on this land for 8 days. "How do you know that?" Rowan said. Eli shrugged in the loose way of teenagers who know things they can't fully explain. "My dad showed me, before." A pause. "He was good at reading land. He said water always tells you what it wants to do if you watch it long enough." Rowan said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He sounds like he was a smart man." "Yeah," Eli said simply. Not sadly, exactly, just honestly. He was. They spent the morning redirecting the creek. It was harder work than resetting posts, but better work, and by noon Rowan was already calculating what it meant for the spring. He didn't say anything to Eli about it, but when they rode back for dinner, he pulled up alongside the boy and said, "Tomorrow I want to show you the water situation on the south pasture. I've been meaning to figure something out about it." Eli looked at him, nodded once. "All right." It was, Rowan realized later, the first time in a very long while that he'd looked forward to a problem. He wasn't sure what to do with that. So he put the firewood on the porch, went inside, and ate the best meal he'd had in 14 months. And somewhere in the warm air of the kitchen, in the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs, and something in the oven he couldn't yet identify, in the sound of Finn asking Hazel what a volcano was, and Hazel explaining it with a thoroughness that was rapidly becoming an argument, Rowan Mercer sat at a table that no longer felt empty. He did not think about Sloan. He did not think about the flour numbers, or the salt pork, or the roof, or the 61 head of cattle that had once been 93. He just sat there. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence inside him was quiet. The cold came earlier than anyone expected that year. It wasn't the hard freeze, that was still weeks away. But by the 3rd week of October, the mornings had teeth, and the afternoons were only pretending to be something warmer. Rowan felt it in his knees when he climbed down from the fence line, and in the way the cattle had started bunching together in the east pasture, which was never a good sign. Animals knew things about weather that no almanac had ever figured out how to print. He mentioned it to Eli one morning while they were checking water troughs, and Eli just looked at the sky the way he'd been looking at the sky lately, with a particular attention that had started to remind Rowan uncomfortably of himself at that age, back when he still believed that paying close attention to things was enough to protect them. "My dad used to say the sky gets a certain color before a hard winter," Eli said. "Like the blue goes a little gray around the edges. Not clouds, just gray." Rowan looked up. The sky was very blue, clear and sharp and cold. "What do you think?" Rowan said. Eli squinted. "I think it's got gray around the edges." They drove the cattle to closer pasture that afternoon without discussing it further. Naomi noticed the shift in the pace of work without being told and adjusted accordingly. The meals started running heavier. More fat in the biscuits, thicker stews, the kind of food that sits in your stomach and argues with the cold. She'd begun going through the pantry with a systematic thoroughness that made Rowan simultaneously grateful and unsettled, because each time she tallied something and wrote the number down, the number was smaller than he'd thought it would be. He hadn't been managing supplies so much as not thinking about them, and there was a difference. "We've got enough lamp oil for about 6 weeks, she told him one evening, not looking up from the ledger she'd started keeping. His ledger, technically, but she'd reorganized it in a way that made it actually readable. "After that, we're burning candles, and you've got maybe 40 of those. I can pick up more on the next supply run." "When's that?" "End of the week." "Add tallow," she said. "We can make more candles if we have enough tallow. And Finn's coat has a tear in the lining that's letting cold through. I can fix it, but I need more batting." "I'll add it." She looked up then. She had a way of looking at him sometimes that wasn't soft exactly, but wasn't hard either. More like calibrated. The way you'd look at something you were trying to measure accurately. You don't have to write it down, she said. I've already written it down. I'll give you the list. He'd been reaching for the pen. He stopped. Right. I'm not trying to take over your ranch, she said. Matter of fact. Not apologetic. I know that. She went back to the ledger. Good. The list she gave him the next morning was 3 pages long, written in a precise hand with quantities and alternates where the primary item might not be available. He stood in the kitchen and read it and thought about Sloane's voice in the feed store. Generous is a fine thing when you can afford it. And then he folded the list into his coat pocket and went to hitch the wagon. He could afford it, or he couldn't. Standing in the kitchen worrying about it wasn't going to change the numbers. Calloway's was busy when he arrived, which wasn't unusual for a Friday morning. What was unusual was the quality of attention that followed him through the door. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody stopped talking. Nobody pointed. But there was a shift. The kind of shift you feel before you see it, in the way a room breathes differently when someone walks in that the room has already been talking about. He picked up the first items on Naomi's list and brought them to the counter, and Calloway greeted him normally enough. But 2 aisles over, Rowan caught the tail end of something. Margaret Decker's voice, pitched low, but not low enough, saying 3 children through a Wyoming winter on that budget. I don't see how he manages it, and then a response he couldn't quite catch, but whose tone he recognized. He kept his eyes on the shelves and kept working through the list. He was at the dry goods when Wade Timmons fell into step beside him. Wade ran a mid-size operation about 6 miles south of Blackstone Ridge, and they'd always gotten along reasonably well. The kind of relationship built on mutual respect for work ethic and a shared willingness to lend tools without making it complicated. Wade was a straight talker, which Rowan had always liked about him, which was why what Wade said next landed the way it did. You doing all right, Rowan? Fine, Rowan said. You? Good enough. A pause. Wade ran his hand along the edge of a flour barrel. Look, I'm just going to say it. People are talking. I know. Sloane's been making the rounds, telling people you've taken on more than you can handle, that by midwinter you'll be looking to sell cattle cheap just to cover your costs. Another pause. He's not wrong about the math, Rowan. I'm not saying I agree with him about everything, but 3 kids on top of a bad year? Eli worked 6 days on my east fence line last week, Rowan said. He kept his voice even. Spotted a creek erosion problem I'd been walking past for 9 years. Fixed it in a morning. Saved me probably 2 days' labor, and who knows how much come spring. He pulled a bag of cornmeal off the shelf. Naomi caught that my second crate of salt pork was turning before I lost all of it. Reorganized my stores so I can actually see what I have. She's been feeding 4 people on what I used to burn through cooking badly, for one. He set the cornmeal in the wagon bed. So when people do the math, Wade, tell them to do all of it. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't know about the fence. No, Rowan said. You didn't. He finished the list and paid what he owed and drove home, and he didn't let himself think about the whispers until he was back on his own land, where they couldn't follow. Naomi had dinner waiting when he came through the door, which he'd told her once she didn't need to do, and she'd said, I know, and kept doing it. The children were at the table already, Eli with a book open beside his plate that he was technically not reading during meals, but technically was. Hazel drawing something in a small notebook she carried everywhere. Finn conducting a conversation with himself about whether bears could swim faster than horses. Rowan hung up his coat and washed his hands and sat down, and Naomi put a bowl in front of him that smelled like the dried thyme from the second cabinet, and something else he'd been too tired to grow himself for years. They're talking in town, he said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out because the kitchen was warm and there was time in the air, and some part of him, without his full authorization, had decided that this was a place where you could say true things. Naomi sat down across from him. I know, she said. I know about Sloane, she said. She said it with a flatness that told him she'd dealt with men like Sloane before, in different landscapes and different contexts, and was not especially afraid of him. He came by. Rowan put down his spoon. What? 2 days ago, while you were on the East Range with Eli. She reached for the bread without any particular urgency. He came to the door. I answered it. Rowan felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the weather. What did he say? He was very polite, Naomi said, and the way she said polite made it clear she didn't mean it as a compliment. He said he was a neighbor and wanted to introduce himself. He asked about the children. He said he hoped we were all comfortable. A pause. Then he said that he'd hate for us to find ourselves in a difficult situation come winter, and that if things got hard, he'd be in a position to help, at a fair price. The table had gone quiet. Even Finn had stopped his bear and horse debate. At a fair price, Rowan repeated. That's what he said. And what did you tell him? Naomi looked at him steadily. I thanked him for stopping by and told him Blackstone Ridge was in good hands. A small pause. Then I closed the door. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. He was aware that the children were watching him, Hazel in particular, with that measuring expression, reading him the way she read everything, filing the results somewhere he couldn't see. He's trying to push us out before winter locks in, Rowan said. Yes, Naomi said. He's been doing it slowly enough that you might not notice each piece separately, but put them together and that's what it is. Eli looked up from his knot book. I wants the land? Some of it, probably, Rowan said. And he wants to buy my cattle cheap if I go under. It's how he operates. He picked up his spoon again. He's patient. He waits until someone is scared enough, and then he helps them right off their own property. The fire popped. Outside, the wind had picked up enough to be audible at the corners of the house. He's not going to get it, Eli said. Not as a question. No, Rowan said. He's not. He said it more certainly than he felt it, and Naomi across the table met his eyes for just a moment with an expression that told him she knew the difference and wasn't going to call it out, which was its own kind of courtesy. Finn, having processed this conversation in his own oblique way, said, Can bears swim faster than horses or not? Faster, Hazel said without looking up from her notebook. How do you know? I read it. When? Before you were born, essentially. Finn considered this. That was a long time ago. Yes, Hazel said. It was. And Rowan, against everything that was pressing on him from the outside and the inside both, found himself swallowing something that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to it, and bent back to his bowl and for 10 minutes forgot about Garrett Sloan entirely. The trouble with forgetting about Garrett Sloan was that Garrett Sloan did not forget about you. 3 days later, Rowan rode into Clearwater to pick up the fencing wire he'd ordered before the Barrett family arrived, and discovered it wasn't there. Calloway told him, with the careful face of a man delivering news he didn't enjoy delivering, that the order had been redirected. The supplier in Cheyenne had a note that the order was canceled and rerouted to the Sloan operation. Redirected, Rowan said. That's what the note says. Calloway put the paper on the counter. The handwriting on the note was neat and businesslike. The supplier's name was at the top. Rowan stared at it long enough to memorize it, then pushed it back. Can you get me wire from somewhere else? I can try. Take longer. Costs more. How much more? Calloway named a figure that was 15% higher than what Rowan had already committed. Rowan thought about the ledger. He thought about Naomi's 3-page list. He thought about the cattle in the pasture and the roof that still needed work and the months between now and spring. Order it, he said. He rode home with the particular internal pressure of a man holding very still so nothing spills. He didn't tell Naomi about the wire right away. He told himself it was because there was no point worrying her over something he'd already handled. But that night, after the children were in bed and the kitchen had settled into its end-of-day quiet, fire low, one lamp burning, the sound of Naomi moving through a last set of tasks she'd never quite learned to leave unfinished, he said it anyway. Sloan interfered with a supply order. She stopped moving. How? Got the wire redirected to his own account. Calloway's ordering from a different supplier. He was looking at his hands, flat on the table. It'll cost more. Take longer. The silence ran for a few seconds. Is the fence situation critical? She asked. Not yet. There's maybe 3 weeks before it matters. Then we've got time. It's the money, Naomi. It's not just, I know what it is. She sat down. She folded her hands in front of her on the table, which he'd noticed she did when she was thinking hard about something and wanted her hands occupied so they didn't betray whatever was happening in her face. He's not trying to break the ranch all at once. He's just going to make everything cost a little more and take a little longer until you're worn down enough to make a decision you wouldn't otherwise make. I know what he's doing. Do you know why he's doing it now? She looked at him directly. He wasn't doing it before we came. I asked Calloway's wife last week. She'll talk if you give her the opportunity. Apparently Sloan made an offer on Blackstone Ridge in July. You turned him down. Rowan went very still. She told you that? She told me Sloan told his wife, who told someone else. It's a small valley. Naomi held his gaze. He came back in August. You turned him down again. He never came to me directly, Rowan said. He used Parsons, the solicitor in town. And you said no both times. This is my ranch. Yes, she said. It is. And he believes that if he applies enough pressure at the right moment, you'll be tired enough and scared enough and alone enough to say yes. She stopped. Then more quietly. You're not alone anymore. It landed differently than she probably meant it, or maybe exactly as she meant it. He couldn't always tell with her, which was a new experience for Rowan, who'd spent 9 years thinking he could read most people at the distance a person needs to read them from for self-protection. That doesn't change the money, he said. No, she agreed, but it changes what you can do in a day, which changes the money. She unfolded her hands. The Hendersons owe you a fence-mending day from the summer, Eli asked around. Wade Timmons has wire he'll trade for help with his cattle come spring. There's 2 sources of wire that don't go through Sloan's suppliers or Calloway's usual contacts. She reached into her apron pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. I started looking into it when the first supply prices went up. I figured something was interfering before you did. Rowan looked at the paper. He looked at her. You figured something was interfering, he said. You're good at running a ranch, she said, and it wasn't flattery. It was the same calibrated assessment she applied to everything. You're not good at noticing when someone's running something against you. You're too straightforward to think sideways. He should have been offended by that. He thought about it for a moment and found that he wasn't. And you are, he said, good at thinking sideways? Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile. More like a thing that had been a smile once, a long time ago, and still moved like one. I've been a widow in a bad position for 2 years, managing 3 children and a pile of debt on a shrinking income in a town where everyone knew my husband died and decided that meant I was someone who needed advice and managing. She picked up the paper and set it closer to him. Yes, I got reasonably good at thinking sideways. He picked up the paper. The sources she'd listed were real and reachable, and she'd noted next to each one whether the contact was trustworthy in her estimation and why. It was thorough without being complicated. It was, he thought, exactly the list a person made who had learned to do things right the first time because there usually wasn't a second chance. This is good, he said. I know, she said, and went back to her last set of tasks. He sat with the paper and thought about Garrett Sloan riding around his valley, knocking on his door, redirecting his wire orders, and talking in feed stores. All that patient, deliberate pressure applied to what Sloan assumed was a man alone and a ranch already failing. He thought about sitting in this same kitchen 2 weeks ago, eating bad coffee and worse eggs, with the specific loneliness of a man who has lived long enough with silence to have stopped noticing how loud it was. He thought, Sloan made a mistake, not a fatal one yet. The man was too careful for fatal mistakes, but a mistake. He'd looked at Blackstone Ridge and seen a failing operation and a grieving man and thought that adding a widow and 3 children was adding weakness. He'd started his campaign to pressure Rowan out before he realized that what had actually arrived on that battered wagon with the squealing axle was exactly what Blackstone Ridge had been missing. Not charity cases, not mouths to feed, but people who already knew how to survive without enough and had gotten genuinely good at it. Sloan had been watching the wrong thing. It was the kind of mistake, Rowan knew, that could turn a slow campaign of pressure into something else entirely, if the person being pressured stopped absorbing it and started redirecting it instead. He wasn't there yet. The money was still real, and the winter was still coming, and the roof still needed work, and 61 head of cattle was not 93. But he folded Naomi's paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, close to his chest. And in the morning, he started using her contacts. The first Henderson brother showed up 3 days later with his own tools and a load of borrowed wire, and by the end of that day, the east fence was done. The day after, his younger brother came with 2 more men, and they spent 6 hours on the barn roof while Naomi fed them lunch that made one of the men say, in complete sincerity, that he hadn't eaten that well since his mother was alive. It was said to Rowan, but Naomi heard it from the kitchen, and she didn't say anything, but she came back to the table with an extra plate of biscuits without being asked. Word spread the way it always did in small places, selectively and imperfectly, in pieces. But the pieces this time were different pieces. Not Rowan Mercer's taking on more than he can handle, but smaller, more specific things. That the Barrett boy had an eye for land problems. That Naomi Barrett's table was something worth sitting at. That Blackstone Ridge was in better shape than it had looked in August. Sloan heard the same pieces, presumably. Rowan knew this because the next time he saw Sloan, at the monthly meeting of Valley Ranchers that nobody could quite avoid without making a statement about it, Sloan's manner had changed slightly. It was subtle, the kind of shift that you'd miss if you weren't looking, but Rowan was looking. The certainty was still there, the broad-shouldered ease of a man who believed his position was unassailable. But around the edges of it, there was something new. Calculation. Sloan was reassessing, which meant he'd noticed something had changed. The meeting itself was held in Calloway's back room, around the long table that served as a community gathering space whenever the community needed gathering. About 15 ranchers showed up. Some Rowan knew well, some he barely knew, some who fell in between. The main topic was winter preparation, roads, supplies, the state of the shared water sources on the western boundary. Rowan sat and listened and contributed when he had something to say, and kept his voice level when Sloan, twice, said things that were technically about community preparation but were aimed at him specifically. About ranches that were overextended, about the risks of sentiment and resource allocation, about how charity in winter was a luxury nobody in the valley could afford. Each time, Rowan let it settle. Didn't bite. He was aware of the room the way you're aware of a room that's listening to you without showing it, each person calculating what the positions in front of them meant for their own situation. It was on the second of those comments that Wade Timmons, without making a production of it, said, "The fence work Eli Barrett did on the Mercer East line saved at least a season of erosion damage. I had a look at it. Boy knows what he's doing." It was said quietly, almost offhand, but it landed. Two other men offered similar small corrections to the ambient narrative over the course of the next hour. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just specific observable facts quietly placed in front of a room that had been running on rumor and Sloan's editorializing. By the end of the meeting, the energy had shifted in some way Rowan couldn't precisely quantify, but could feel, like the creek on the East Range, cut in a different direction. He was outside afterward, checking his horse's cinch before heading home, when Hazel turned up beside him. He startled. He hadn't known she was there. "What are you doing in town?" he said. "Mom said I could come with you if I stayed quiet," Hazel said. She'd apparently taken the instruction seriously and had sat somewhere in the meeting room so still that Rowan hadn't noticed her. "I was listening." "I know you were. What did you make of it?" She considered this with her usual deliberateness. She was 10 years old, with her mother's posture and her mother's eyes, and a brain that Rowan had come to understand was always several steps ahead of the conversation she was currently having. "Mr. Sloan is scared of something," she said. Rowan looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "People who are sure they're going to win don't work that hard to make everyone agree with them." She pulled her coat tighter. "He keeps saying you're going to fail, but if he really believed it, he'd just wait. He wouldn't keep saying it." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's a smart observation," he said. "I know," Hazel said, completely without arrogance, just the same calibrated accuracy her mother used. "Can we go home? I want to tell Mom what happened." They rode back in the deepening cold, the late afternoon light going thin and sharp the way it did in October when the season was making up its mind about what it was going to be. The horse's breath made small clouds. The valley lay around them, familiar and unforgiving and, for reasons Rowan hadn't entirely sorted out yet, no longer quite as lonely as it had looked 3 weeks ago. Hazel rode behind him and didn't talk, which he'd come to understand was not a sign that she wasn't thinking, but rather the opposite. And somewhere around the halfway point she said, out of a long silence, "Mr. Mercer, sir." "Yeah." "Why didn't you turn us away when we first came?" He thought about it. He thought about Finn and the pebble. He thought about Eli going straight to the horse's leg. He thought about Naomi standing in the dirt yard and saying, "We come together, or we don't come at all," with the flat certainty of someone who has already decided this is the condition she'll hold even if it costs her. I don't know, he said honestly. Seemed like the thing to do. Hazel processed this. My mom says people are usually one thing, or they're another thing, she said. She says it's not easy to tell which until something goes sideways. Your mom's right about most things. I know, Hazel said. She knows that too. It's not her best quality. Rowan made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. They came through the gate of Blackstone Ridge just as the light was going, and from across the yard came the smell of dinner and the sound of Finn inside explaining something at great volume, and the lamp in the kitchen window made a small yellow square against the coming dark. It was not enough to fix everything. The roof had one section that was going to be trouble. The money was tighter than he wanted. The winter hadn't started yet, and he knew better than anyone what Wyoming winters could do to the best-laid plans. But Rowan Mercer looked at that small yellow square of light and felt, with a clarity that surprised him, that he was riding toward something rather than back to something. That was the difference. That was what had changed. He'd spent 9 years coming home to a house that held him at arm's length. And now, for reasons that had arrived on a battered wagon with a squealing axle, he found himself moving toward his own gate the way you move toward a thing you haven't lost yet. He didn't put a name to it. He wasn't ready for that. He just rode in, unsaddled the horse, and went inside. And the door opened before he reached it, because Finn had been watching the window. The first real snow came on a Thursday, not the dusting that had been threatening all week, the kind that melts by mid-morning and leaves the ground looking embarrassed about the attempt. This was the real thing. Rowan woke before 4 and lay still for a moment, listening to the quality of the silence outside, which was different from ordinary silence in a way that any person who has lived through enough Wyoming winters learns to identify without thinking about it. Heavier, more absolute. The silence of a world that has been muffled. He got up, looked out the window, and felt the familiar cold weight settle into his chest. 8 inches on the ground and still coming down. He dressed fast and was pulling on his coat in the kitchen when he heard Eli behind him, already dressed, already moving toward the door, with the unhurried competence that had stopped surprising Rowan sometime around week 2. Cattle first, Rowan said. Yeah, Eli said. I'll take the east pasture. You know where the extra hay is? 3rd bay, back left. I checked it yesterday. He pulled his hat down. The water troughs are going to be iced over. I know. I've got the axe. They went out into it together. The snow was still heavy, falling straight down with no wind yet, which was the only mercy. And the world had contracted to the circle of what the lantern showed, which was not much. Rowan broke ice on the north troughs while Eli handled the east, and by the time the sky had gone from black to the deep gray blue that passed for dawn, they'd worked through the worst of the immediate problems and were back in the barn with 4 cattle that had been drifting toward the fence line and needed discouraging. Naomi had breakfast on the table when they came in, stamping snow off their boots at the door. She didn't ask how bad it was. She'd looked out the window herself. She poured coffee and put the plates down and said, The second window on the north side is letting cold through the sill. I stuffed it with rags last night, but it needs proper sealing. I'll do it today. Hazel found it, she said. She was cold in the night and went looking for why. Rowan looked over at Hazel, who was eating toast with the concentrated expression of someone who has already moved on to the next problem and is only partially present at the table. Good catch, he said. Hazel said without looking up, The south window has the same issue, but less bad. You should do both. I'll do both, Rowan said. Finn, who had been watching the snow fall outside the window with the intense appreciation of a child who had not yet been asked to do anything useful in it, said, Can I go out? After breakfast, Naomi said. I'm done with breakfast. You have 3 bites left. Finn examined his plate with the look of a man reviewing a contract he found unreasonable. These are small bites. Eat them, Naomi said. And Finn ate them, because whatever else was uncertain in his young life, the particular tone his mother used for eat them was not a thing you negotiated with. That first week of real snow settled into a rhythm that was brutal in the way frontier winters were always brutal. Not dramatic, exactly, just relentless. Every morning, the first hour was crisis management, ice, animals, the particular small disasters that accumulated overnight when the temperature dropped. Every afternoon was recovery and preparation. Every evening was Naomi at the stove and the ledger and the mending, accounting for everything used and planning what came next, while Rowan sat across from her and they worked through the numbers together in a way that had stopped feeling businesslike somewhere around the third week of it. He noticed, somewhere in that first week of snow, that he'd stopped eating standing at the counter. He noticed it the way you notice something that's been changing gradually, all at once, and then you wonder how long it's been true. The wolves came on the 8th day. Rowan heard them first, well after midnight, and was out of bed before he was fully awake. That particular sharpening that happens when a rancher's sleeping brain registers the right kind of animal distress from a distance. He pulled on his boots and coat and took the rifle from beside the door and was across the yard in the dark when Eli appeared behind him, because Eli apparently slept the same way Rowan did, with one ear always outside. "How many?" Eli said quietly. "3, maybe 4. South side." They moved together around the barn in the dark, and Rowan fired twice into the air when they were close enough to scatter, and the wolves went, for tonight. He stood in the snow with the rifle and listened to the cattle settle and his own heartbeat slow. "They'll be back," Eli said. "I know. We need to move the vulnerable animals closer to the barn, first thing tomorrow." Eli was quiet for a moment. The snow had stopped for now, and the sky had that particular winter clarity that made everything very far away look very close, the stars hard and sharp overhead. "My dad and I used to run night watches on the farm," Eli said. "In spring, when the predators were hungry after winter, we'd take turns." Rowan lowered the rifle. He didn't look at the boy directly. Some conversations needed to happen sideways, without the pressure of eye contact. "You miss it," he said. Not a question. "I miss him," Eli said. Simple, without performance. "The farm I don't miss so much. The farm was just a place. He's the part that mattered." They stood in the snow for another moment. "I know something about that," Rowan said. Eli nodded once, in the dark. The nod of someone who already knew that and hadn't needed it said, but appreciated it anyway. They went back inside and Rowan lay awake for a while, not thinking about anything specific, just listening to the house breathe around him. The creak of the roof under snow, the low sound of the fire banked for the night, the particular silence of 3 children sleeping down the hall, that it was nothing like the silence of an empty house and never had been. The wolf problem required a solution that cost 2 days of work he didn't have to spare, but the alternative cost more. He and Eli built a temporary enclosure closer to the barn, reinforced with the wire from the Henderson trade, and moved 11 head of younger cattle into it. It wasn't pretty work and it wasn't finished work, but it held, and the wolves tested the edges twice more over the following week and eventually moved on to easier ground. Hazel, who had been watching the enclosure construction with her notebook, presented Rowan with a sketch of a modification on the 3rd day. "If you angle this section here," she said, pointing, "and add a second horizontal wire at this height, the wolves can't get their front paws up to push. They try to climb, not dig, usually. I read about it." Rowan looked at the sketch. He looked at her. "When did you read about wolf behavior?" "There were books in the second bedroom," she said. "I hope that's all right. I've been reading them at night." The second bedroom was what had been May's room. Rowan hadn't been in it in a year. There were apparently books in it that he'd forgotten about. "That's all right," he said. He made the modification. The wolves didn't come back. The blizzard arrived on the 14th of November without much warning, or rather, with the warnings that the land gave if you knew what to look for, which Rowan did, but the speed of it still caught him underprepared in one specific way. He had hay in the north lot that needed to be moved to the main barn before the drifts made it unreachable, and he'd planned to do it the morning the sky started telling him what was coming, but the sky moved faster than he did. By noon, the visibility was down to 30 feet and dropping. He was in the barn when Eli appeared at the door, breathing hard, snow crusted on his shoulders and hat. "North lot," Eli said. "I know, I'm going." "I'll go." "You're not going," Rowan said. Because the north lot was a quarter-mile through open ground, and the wind had come up in the last hour to something that wasn't safe for a man, let alone a 14-year-old boy. "I know that ground," Eli said. "I've walked it every day for 3 weeks." "Eli, 2 loads will do it. I'm faster than you." He said it without insolence, just math. "And you need to be here for the cattle if anything goes wrong." Rowan stood and looked at him. He thought about what it meant to be responsible for a child who was standing in front of you making a completely logical argument for doing something dangerous, and how there was no version of this that didn't feel like a loss of some kind. "You take the rope from the east hook," Rowan said. "You tie it to the lot gate, and you hold it the whole way back. If you can't see the barn, you stop moving." "Understood." "If the rope runs out before you reach the barn, you tie off and you wait." "I know what to do in a whiteout," Eli said. "My dad taught me." Rowan held his gaze for another second. Then he stepped aside. Eli went out into the blizzard with the rope and his own particular combination of recklessness and competence, and Rowan stood at the barn door and watched the boy's outline shrink into the white until he couldn't see it anymore. And then he stood there anyway. He came back twice, loaded, on time. The second load he brought in his arms rather than a barrow because the wind had made the barrow impossible, and he came through the barn door looking like something that had been dragged backward through winter and was annoyed about it. And he dropped the hay and said, "That's enough for 3 days," and went to check on the cattle. Rowan watched him go. He thought about Thomas Barrett, the man who had been a good man but not a sturdy one, who had taught his son to tie a rope in a blizzard and read the creek and examine a horse's leg without being asked. "I thought about what it cost to raise a person who was useful and careful and honest, and how that cost didn't disappear when the person who paid it did." He didn't say any of this to Eli. But when the boy came back from checking the cattle, Rowan had hot coffee waiting for him without being asked about it, and Eli took it and wrapped both hands around it and said thanks in the distracted way of someone whose mind was already 3 tasks ahead, which was, Rowan thought, the correct response. The water crisis came on the 22nd of November. It came quietly, which was how the serious ones always came. Rowan noticed it first in the morning trough check. The pressure from the main line was lower than it should have been. He traced it through the day, checking junctions, and by afternoon had concluded that the primary line from the spring had frozen somewhere in the 100 yards between the source and the first junction. It happened sometimes in hard winters. The solution was usually straightforward and miserable. Dig down to the line, apply heat, pray the pipe hadn't cracked. The problem was that the ground was frozen to a depth that made digging it by hand a full day's work, minimum, and they had maybe 2 days of reserve water before things got critical for the animals. He was explaining this to Naomi that evening, going through the options, when Hazel said, "There's another spring." Both adults looked at her. She had her notebook open on the table and she was pointing at a page that had, Rowan realized, a rough sketch of the property. Not a bad sketch either. She had the topography roughly right, which meant she'd been paying attention on the ride-alongs he hadn't realized she was memorizing. "North of the main spring," she said. "About 200 yards, I think. Maybe more. There's a spot where the snow melts faster than it should. I noticed it last week when Eli and I were walking the fence. The ground there is different, softer, even in the freeze." Rowan stared at the sketch. "There's no secondary spring on this property," he said. "I've been here 9 years." "Maybe you never looked at this exact spot," Hazel said. "Not unkindly, just the facts." Naomi said nothing. She was watching Rowan with an expression that was withholding judgment carefully. Rowan looked at the sketch for another long moment. Then he said, "Where exactly?" Hazel showed him on the sketch with a small cross mark she'd made in pencil. He went out in the morning cold before full light and found the spot she'd described, and stood over it, and pushed a long stick down into the ground, and felt it go soft at a depth that shouldn't have been soft given 2 weeks of hard freeze. He dug. 3 feet down, he hit water. Moving water. Not a trickle, but a genuine flow, coming from somewhere upstream in the rock, and moving through ground warm enough to stay liquid even in this cold. He stood in a hole in the frozen ground on his own property, surrounded by land he'd walked for 9 years, staring at water he hadn't known was there. Then he climbed out and went back to the house and said to Hazel, who was eating breakfast, "You found a spring." She looked up. "I thought so." "You thought so?" He sat down across from her. "Why didn't you say something when you saw it?" "I wasn't sure," she said. "I didn't want to send you out on a maybe." "But you drew it in the notebook." "In case it became relevant." Naomi put a plate in front of him. She said nothing. But she refilled Hazel's milk, which in the Barrett family economy was apparently a significant gesture, because Hazel noticed it and sat up slightly straighter and went back to her breakfast with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has just received the recognition they needed and don't require anything more elaborate than that. The secondary spring changed everything about the water situation. It wasn't a permanent solution. It would need proper piping come spring, and the flow rate was slower than the main line, but it was enough. More than enough to get them through until the primary line thawed. Rowan spent 2 days getting it set up properly, with Eli doing the grunt work, and Hazel, improbably, directing the angle of the preliminary channel with the focus of someone who had been thinking about drainage problems in her spare time, because she was 10 years old, and that was apparently how she spent her spare time. He wrote a letter to May that night. He hadn't written in 3 weeks, which was longer than usual. He sat at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep and started it the way he always started. Dear May, I hope you are well. And then he sat for a while not writing, and then he wrote something he hadn't expected to write. There is a girl here named Hazel who found a spring on this property that I had never noticed in 9 years. She is 10 years old, and she keeps a notebook. She reminds me of you, a little, in the way that she sees things. I wanted you to know I'm telling you about her. He didn't write much else. He folded it and addressed it and left it on the table to go out with the next supply run. He didn't examine too carefully what it meant that he'd written it. The cattle thieves came on the night of the 30th of November. They came late, well past midnight, in the dead of the night's coldest hours, which was calculated because the coldest hours were the ones when even a careful man was deepest asleep. Rowan would have slept through it. He was not proud of this fact, but it was true. It was Finn who woke him. The boy had appeared at Rowan's bedroom door, which nobody had ever knocked at before in all the weeks since the family arrived, and was standing in the hallway in his nightshirt, holding a candle stub, with an expression on his face that was not exactly frightened but was very serious. "There's a sound," Finn said. Rowan sat up. "What kind of sound?" "The cows sound wrong," Finn said. "Not scared like the wolf times. Different wrong." Rowan was out of bed and at the window in seconds. He couldn't see much. It was very dark, cloud-covered, but he could hear what Finn meant. The cattle were moving, not panicked moving, but directed moving, and they shouldn't have been moving at all at this hour. He grabbed the rifle. He moved fast but quiet through the house and out the back door, not taking a lantern, letting his eyes adjust to the dark as he crossed the yard toward the barn. He heard them before he saw them. 3 men, he thought, maybe 4, working at the near enclosure gate, moving 4 or 5 head of cattle toward the open pasture boundary where they'd have horses waiting. He fired into the air once. The movement stopped. He fired again and shouted, and from behind him heard Eli's voice joining in, and then, from the left side, in a position that made no logical sense, another voice shouting, low and clear. One of the thieves broke and ran. The others followed. They went fast, abandoning the cattle, and within 2 minutes the sound of horses was fading south. Rowan stood in the dark with the rifle and his own breath coming hard and the cattle milling nervously in the enclosure. Then he turned to find the source of the voice on the left flank. It was Eli. He'd gone around the barn the other way, in the dark, in the snow, to come at the situation from the opposite angle. He hadn't been told to do this. He had simply done it because it was tactically correct, and he'd had a few seconds to think and had used them. He was standing in the snow in his coat thrown over his nightshirt and his boots on the wrong feet, which Rowan could see when he lifted the lantern. "Boots are on wrong," Rowan said. Eli looked down. "I was in a hurry. How many did you see?" 4, I think. 1 stayed with the horses. The other 3 were at the gate. He was matter-of-fact about it, like a man debriefing, not a 14-year-old boy who had just run around a barn in the dark to flank cattle thieves. "You shouldn't have gone around alone," Rowan said. "Probably," Eli said. Not defensive, not apologetic, just assessing honestly. "Did it work?" Rowan looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "It worked." They stood in the cold for a moment, listening to the retreating horses that could no longer be heard at all. "They'll come back," Eli said. Same tone he'd used about the wolves. "Probably," Rowan agreed. "We need someone watching at night." "I know. We should tell the other ranchers. If they're doing this here, they're doing it elsewhere too." Rowan looked at the boy. He thought, here it is. The thing he hadn't wanted to think about, but which the winter had been building toward for weeks in its slow, implacable way. A ranch was not an island, never had been. He'd been running it like one since Clara died, which had worked in the specific sense of keeping him going, and failed in every deeper sense of what surviving actually required. The thieves came back 2 nights later. This time, Rowan was ready. He'd told Wade Timmons and two other nearby ranchers, and they'd come to his place and spent the night. And when the figures appeared again at the enclosure gate, they were met with 3 rifles and 4 men and a dog that the Timmons family had brought along, who had opinions about cattle thieves that he expressed vocally and at length. The thieves did not come back a third time. But what stayed with Rowan, what sat in him for days afterward, was the meeting that happened in his barn the morning after, when 4 ranchers stood in the cold and drank Naomi's coffee and talked with a frankness that Rowan hadn't heard in a valley meeting in years. Because the threat was immediate and concrete, all the careful social management dissolved, and what was left was just men who needed to figure something out together and were finally willing to say so. Wade Timmons said, "We should be pooling night watch, rotating. Nobody can do it alone every night through the winter." Henderson's older brother said, "I've got feed to spare from the south pasture. My north line is short, though." Wade said, "I've got north line hay. Trade?" They worked it out in 20 minutes. 20 minutes, standing in Rowan's barn, that accomplished what 6 months of polite valley meetings had not: an actual, specific agreement to share specific resources in specific ways. Because they were cold and tired, and a real threat had made the cost of not cooperating suddenly visible. Naomi came to the barn door to say there was food on, and the ranchers filed in and sat at her table, which was not large enough, and so some of them stood, and she fed them all without making a production of it, and without asking anyone's preference, just putting food in front of people until there was no food left and then making more. And at some point during the 3rd pot of coffee, someone said something that made everyone laugh. And it was not the polite laughter of men performing sociability, but the real thing, surprised out of them. Rowan stood at the edge of it and watched. He watched Naomi moving through it with the ease of a woman who had been feeding groups of people in inadequate spaces for long enough that it had become instinctive. He watched Eli talking to Wade's oldest son, who was 17 and had apparently discovered that Eli knew more about cattle than most men twice his age, with an animation he didn't usually show. He watched Hazel in the corner with her notebook, recording something with intense focus, and he thought she was probably doing a census of everyone in the room and their resources, which would turn out to be accurate. And he watched Finn sitting on the knee of Henderson's youngest brother, who was barely 20 and had been telling the story of the dog and the cattle thieves for the 3rd time to everyone's increasing amusement, and Finn was laughing with his whole body the way only very small children laugh, throwing his head back, completely unself-conscious, and the sound of it moved through the crowded kitchen the way warm air moves, without asking permission, finding every cold corner. Rowan thought, this is what it's supposed to look like. Not his ranch, not his kitchen, not his careful managed survival. This specific collection of imperfect people with too little space and not enough food and a genuine problem to solve, laughing in a room that had been silent for a year and a half. He didn't know how to hold that thought and look at it directly. It was too much the shape of something he'd stopped letting himself want. So he picked up an empty coffee pot and went to the stove, and Naomi was already there. And they stood side by side in the small space between the stove and the wall, and she handed him the refilled pot without turning, the way you hand something to a person you know the position of without looking, and he took it without looking at her, and the kitchen was loud around them. "You did this," he said, quiet enough that it was only for her. She shook her head. "You did this," she said. "You opened the gate." He thought about the notice he'd put up in Callaway's. No trouble. As though you could put up a fence against the particular kind of trouble that turned out to be the thing your life had been missing. He went back out and refilled cups, and the morning went on, and outside the snow was coming down again, and the valley was cold and the winter was not finished, and probably wouldn't be for months. But in the kitchen of Blackstone Ridge, the fire burned high, and the room was full, and the man who had built his life around a specific amount of emptiness stood in the middle of something that was the opposite of empty and felt, with the slow, stunned clarity of a man who has been proved wrong about something important, that he did not miss the emptiness at all. Not even a little. Not even on purpose. December came in like a fist, not the slow tightening that October had been, or November's steady escalation. December arrived with the particular violence of a season that has run out of patience. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single night, and by morning, the valley looked like something that had never been warm and didn't intend to start. Ice on the water lines, ice on the barn door hinges, ice on the inside of the north window that Rowan had sealed twice already and apparently needed to seal a third time with something better than rags and good intentions. Rowan was up at 3:30 and didn't bother going back to bed. The cooperative arrangement with the neighboring ranchers, the one that had come together so quickly in his barn after the thief incident, had settled into something functional, if not exactly smooth. They rotated night watch duty among 4 properties, which meant each man had coverage 3 nights out of 4, which meant each man could sleep 3 nights out of 4, which was 3 more than they'd been managing before. The hay trade with Timmons was working. The Henderson brothers had started leaving messages with Calloway when they had surplus of anything, and Rowan had started doing the same. And it wasn't a system exactly, more like a habit that was slowly becoming a system. It was more than any of them had managed in the previous 3 winters combined. Naomi had noticed this and said nothing about it, which was how she handled things she thought were fragile. She gave them room to grow without touching them. Rowan had noticed that about her and said nothing about it, which was how he handled things he found himself paying attention to in ways he wasn't ready to examine. December 2nd was Finn's birthday. Rowan didn't know this until the morning of, when he came downstairs to find Naomi doing something complicated with a very limited amount of sugar and the expression of a woman solving a problem she'd been working on for days. He stood in the doorway and she looked up and said without preamble, "Finn is 6 today. I have enough for a small cake, but not enough for frosting unless you have molasses anywhere I haven't found." "Second shelf of the back pantry," Rowan said, "behind the lamp oil." She stared at him. "You've had molasses this whole time." "I forgot it was there." She turned back to the stove with the specific energy of a woman who has decided that saying what she's thinking is not worth the time it would take. Rowan got his own coffee and located the molasses and put it on the counter beside her without comment. He didn't think about birthdays on his ranch. He hadn't thought about them in a long time. May's birthday in January had come and gone last year with a letter and nothing else, because there was nothing else he'd known how to do from a distance, and he told himself that was sufficient and done his best to believe it. He thought about that, standing in the kitchen with Naomi's back to him and molasses on the counter. He went out to the barn and spent 20 minutes looking for something useful to give a 6-year-old boy who already treated every pebble like it was potentially extraordinary. He found, in the back corner of the tack room behind a box of old equipment, a small carved wooden horse that had been May's. Small enough to fit in a coat pocket, worn smooth from years of handling, the paint mostly gone, but the shape of it clear and confident. He stood with it in his hand for a moment. Then he took it inside and put it on the kitchen table next to Finn's breakfast plate. Finn came downstairs at his usual pace, which was somewhere between falling and running, and pulled up short when he saw the table. Naomi had arranged things. Not elaborately. She wasn't a woman who wasted effort on elaboration, but intentionally. The carved horse. A small folded paper from Hazel that turned out to contain a detailed and scientifically accurate description of every large animal Finn had ever expressed interest in, illustrated in her precise hand. From Eli, a slingshot that he'd made himself over the previous week from a forked branch and a piece of leather, assembled in secret in the evenings when Finn was already in bed. Finn stood at the table and looked at all of it. Then he picked up the wooden horse. He turned it over in his hands the way he turned over pebbles, with that particular reverence of a child who has learned that small things repay attention. He looked at Rowan across the table. "Is this yours?" he said. "It was," Rowan said. "It's yours now." Finn looked at it for another moment. Then he looked back up, and Rowan was not prepared for the expression on the boy's face, which was not the explosive gratitude of a child who has received a gift, but something quieter and more serious. The look of someone who understood, on some level he couldn't have articulated, that what he was holding had history in it. "Thank you," Finn said. Not the automatic thank you of a prompted child. The real one. Rowan said, "You're welcome," and picked up his coffee, and Naomi turned back to the stove, and the morning went on. But the carved horse sat on the table, and Finn kept his hand on it through most of breakfast, not playing with it, just keeping it close, like it was something that might leave if he let go. The crisis with the feed came on December 9th. Rowan had known it was building. He'd done the numbers enough times to see the shape of what was coming. The hay reserves were holding, but barely, and the cattle were eating more in the cold than his projections had allowed for. He'd been compensating with the Timmons trade, but that had limits, and the limits were approaching faster than the calendar was moving. He put the problem on the kitchen table the way he'd started putting problems on the kitchen table, not because he'd decided Naomi had a stake in them, but because she did, and pretending otherwise would have been a specific kind of dishonesty. He'd lost the taste for somewhere around week 4. "If we get another hard week like the last one," he said, "I'm short on feed by Christmas." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "How short?" "Enough to notice." She looked at the numbers. She'd gotten very familiar with his handwriting over the past 2 months and could read his calculations without him explaining them. "The cattle or the horses?" she said. "Both, if it goes long enough." "What are the options?" "Cull some cattle now and use what we save, or find additional feed somewhere, or—" He paused. He hadn't quite said the third option out loud yet because saying it out loud made it real. "Or," Naomi said, "or I reach out to the valley, ask if anyone has surplus they'd sell." He looked at the table. "Which means admitting publicly that I'm short, which is information Sloan would use." Naomi said, "Sloan already knows you're short. He's been tracking this all season." She said it without gentleness because gentleness around facts wasn't her way. "The question is whether protecting your pride costs you cattle." "It's not pride," Rowan said, more sharply than he intended. "What is it then?" He was quiet for a moment. "It's, people here remember. If you're the man who came up short one winter, you're the man who comes up short. It follows you." "Maybe," Naomi said, "or maybe you're the man who asked his neighbors for help and then stood beside them when they needed the same thing. That follows you too." She met his gaze. "Which one you end up being depends on what you do next, not on what Sloan says about you." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the wall behind the numbers, which didn't have anything useful on it, but gave him somewhere to put his eyes while he thought. "You've done this before," he said. "Not the feed problem, something larger. Asked for help when you didn't want to. Every month for 8 months after Thomas died," she said. "I hated every single time." A pause. "It got easier. Not because it stopped being hard, because I stopped thinking of it as something to be ashamed of and started thinking of it as just a thing that needed doing." He thought about that. Then he wrote a note to Timmons and Henderson and 2 other ranchers and sent Eli out with it the next morning. The responses came back within 2 days. Timmons had hay he'd oversupplied for. Henderson had grain. Neither of them made anything of it. The notes were brief and businesslike, as though this were simply a transaction and not a man asking for help for the first time in 9 years. Which was, Rowan thought, the correct way to handle it. No drama, no ceremony. Just neighbors doing what neighbors were supposed to do. He was moving the feed from Timmons's delivery into the barn when he looked up and found Wade standing in the barn door, not moving, with an expression Rowan hadn't seen on the man before. "Something wrong?" Rowan said. Wade came in and leaned against the stall partition. "Had an interesting conversation in town yesterday," he said. "Sloan came to see me." Rowan set down the feed bag. "About?" "About you." Wade's voice was careful. "He's offering to buy the Barrett woman's debt." Rowan went very still. "What debt?" "Apparently she owes back taxes on a property in Kansas. Nothing huge, but enough to make trouble. Sloan says he's been in contact with someone in the county office there." Wade looked uncomfortable. "He's saying if he acquires the debt, she's got a legal problem that follows her. He can't do much with it directly, but it's pressure. On her, and by extension, on you." The barn was very quiet. "He's going after her," Rowan said. "He's going after her to get at you," Wade said. "Which is worse, probably." He paused. "I'm telling you because I told him to his face I wanted no part of it, and I thought you should know. That's all I'm here for." Rowan stood in the cold barn and felt something move through him that was different from the usual anger Sloan provoked. This wasn't the frustration of a man being inconvenienced. This was something older and harder, the specific anger of a person who has watched something harmless be targeted specifically because it's connected to them. "How long has he been sitting on this?" Rowan said. "Don't know. Long enough to find it." Wade pushed off the partition. "I don't know what you're going to do about it. That's your business. I thought you should know before she found out some other way." He left. Rowan stood in the barn alone for a while, looking at the feed he'd just moved and the cattle in the stalls and the slow work of a season that was wearing everyone down by degrees. He thought about Naomi at his kitchen table, doing his accounts with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to make every small thing count, because small things were sometimes all you had. He thought about her standing in the dirt yard of his ranch on that first October afternoon, exhausted down to the marrow, saying we come together or we don't come at all. He thought about what it meant that Sloan, who had access to lawyers and land and supply lines and decades of accumulated influence, had looked at everything available to him and chosen to go after a widow's back taxes on a Kansas farm that didn't even exist anymore. It meant he was getting worried. It meant the pressure campaign wasn't working the way it was supposed to, and he was escalating. It meant, underneath everything else, that Hazel had been right. A man who was certain he was going to win didn't work this hard. Rowan went inside. Naomi was in the kitchen, as she usually was at this hour, but she was sitting at the table rather than standing at the stove, which meant she'd already stopped moving, which meant something had already reached her. She had a piece of paper in front of her. He recognized the official look of it from across the room. "You already know," he said. A letter came with the afternoon delivery. Her voice was even, too even. The evenness that requires maintenance rather than the kind that comes naturally. Someone in Clearwater sent it on, originally addressed to me at a forwarding address I'd left with a neighbor in Kansas. She smoothed the paper once with her palm. "It's from a debt collector. They're representing someone who recently acquired my back taxes." "Sloan," Rowan said. She looked up. "You knew?" "Wade just told me. I was coming to tell you." He sat down across from her. "What does it amount to?" $62, she said, "which sounds manageable unless you're me right now." A pause. "And they're adding fees, and apparently there's a filing in the county records that could make certain things complicated for me." She stopped. "It's not the money. $62 I can figure out. It's that he's found a way to make my name attached to a legal problem that follows you out here." She said it with the flat recognition of someone repeating a truth she'd heard from Rowan's own mouth recently, and the irony of it sat between them without comment. "I'll cover the $62, Rowan said. "No," she said immediately. "Naomi, no." Firm. Not angry, but absolute. "That's not how this works." "How does it work then?" She looked at him directly. "I don't take money from you. That's not what I'm here for, and it's not who I am. I've been very careful about what this arrangement is." A pause. "I pay my own debts." "Your debt is being used as a weapon against me," Rowan said, "which makes it partly my problem." She opened her mouth and closed it again. That was unusual for her. She was not a woman who ran out of responses. "I have the $62, Rowan said. "I have it as of this morning's transaction with Timmons, which I wouldn't have if you hadn't pushed me to ask for help when I didn't want to. So if you want to frame it as paying your own debts, you can frame it that way." He kept his voice level. "But I'm not watching Sloan use you to get to me when I can stop it." A long silence. "You'd have to send it to a Kansas County office," she said finally. "I have the address." "Give it to me." "Rowan." She said his name differently than she usually did, not as a way of getting his attention, but as a way of making sure he was actually there, actually present, for whatever she was about to say. "This isn't going to make him stop. You know that." "I know," he said, "but it takes this particular thing away from him, and I want to take things away from him." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she wrote the address on a piece of paper and put it on the table between them. And he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and went to write the bank draft, and neither of them said anything else about it. But when he passed back through the kitchen 20 minutes later with the envelope sealed and addressed, Naomi said to the stove, "I'll pay it back." "I know you will," he said, and went out to put it with the outgoing mail. He never expected it to be paid back, and he suspected she knew that. But some things needed to be said to stay true, and the fact that they both understood the difference was, he was beginning to realize, one of the more important things about knowing Naomi Barrett. The week before Christmas brought the worst stretch of weather the valley had seen in 11 years, according to Henderson's older brother, who was old enough to be a reliable source on that particular subject. 4 days of temperatures that made the previous cold feel moderate, wind that found every gap in every structure and reminded you it had been there first, and a snow accumulation that made the distances between buildings on the ranch feel like genuine expeditions. On the third day of the bad stretch, Eli's horse turned up lame. It was the left rear fetlock, the same leg the mare had been protecting when they had arrived. It had held through 2 months of hard work, but the cold and the accumulated strain of a Wyoming winter had found the weakness that the October journey had started. The horse couldn't be worked, possibly for weeks. Eli said nothing when Rowan told him. He stood in the barn and looked at the horse, and then looked at the work chart on the barn wall. The daily rotation they'd developed over the past weeks, each task assigned, each hour allocated, and Rowan could see him doing the math and not liking the result. "I can do the east line on foot," Eli said. "In this weather you cannot," Rowan said. "I've done it before." "Not in this, and not every day." Rowan looked at the horse. "She needs rest and warm poultice twice a day, consistent." "I know how to treat a fetlock," Eli said. He wasn't being sharp about it, just accurate. "My dad showed me." "I know he did." Rowan paused. "You can't do both. The east line and the horse. Not in this weather, not alone." Eli's jaw was tight. "Someone else has to take the east line then." "Yes." "Who?" "I will," Rowan said. "And you stay with the horse." Eli looked at him. The math of this was apparent to both of them. The east line in this weather was 2 hours of hard work, minimum, and Rowan already had the north line and the main barn. He'd be adding hours he didn't have to a day that was already too long. "That's too much," Eli said. "It's manageable." "It's not, and you know it's not." Eli turned back to the horse, ran his hand along her neck. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter. "She's the only thing we have left from before. My mom doesn't talk about it, but I know." He was quiet for a moment. "After my dad died and we lost the farm, this horse was what we kept. Everything else went to pay debts. We kept her." Rowan stood in the cold barn and said nothing. "I'll do the east line," Eli said. "I'll figure out the weather." "No," Rowan said. "You stay with the horse. I told you I'll handle it." "You don't have to, Eli." Rowan waited until the boy looked at him. "I know I don't have to. I'm doing it anyway. That's a different thing." He picked up the poultice from the shelf. "Warm it before you put it on. Your hands first, then the cloth." Eli watched him for a moment. Something moved across his face that was too complicated for a 14-year-old face to be entirely at home with. Gratitude and grief tangled up together in a way the boy hadn't quite figured out how to separate yet. "I know how to warm it," Eli said. "I know you do," Rowan said, and went out into the wind. He did the east line for 4 days. He came back from it each day looking like something the winter had chewed on and set aside. And Naomi put hot food in front of him without discussion, and he ate it without discussion, and went back out to the afternoon work, and the days went. On the 4th day, the weather broke. Not spring, nothing so dramatic, just a lifting, a slight rise in temperature, the wind pulling back to something that didn't feel personal. Rowan came in from the east line that afternoon, and Naomi had coffee on the table, and Finn was at the window watching the sky like it owed him something, and Hazel was reading one of May's books. And somewhere in the back of the barn, Eli was talking to a horse that was going to be fine, probably, in another week or two. Rowan sat down and put both hands around the coffee cup and felt the heat move through his palms. "Sloan's north barn collapsed," Naomi said. He looked up. "Calloway's wife told me this morning, weight of the snow on a roof that needed work. Lost 14 head of cattle that were sheltered in it." She said it without satisfaction, just the facts, laid flat. "He's in trouble." Rowan looked at the table. "How bad?" "Bad enough that people are talking about it." She sat down across from him. "He's lost more than 14. Some went through the fence when the barn wall came down. People are finding them on other properties." The kitchen was quiet. "He'll be coming to the valley for help," Rowan said. "Probably. And the valley will remember how he spent this season." "Probably," she said again. He thought about Sloane's voice in the feed store. Generous is a fine thing when you can afford it. He thought about the letter to Naomi, the redirected wire order, the visits and the pressure and the patient campaign of a man who believed that comfort and security were things you protected by making sure other people had less of them. "He's going to come to me," Rowan said. It wasn't a question. Naomi said nothing. "I'm the closest operation that's holding together," Rowan said, "and he knows I know it, and he's going to need to come here, after everything, and ask." He looked at his coffee. "I've been thinking about what I do when that happens." "And?" Naomi said. "And I keep going back to something you said. About asking for help. He turned the cup in his hands. You said it gets easier when you stop thinking of it as something to be ashamed of and start thinking of it as just a thing that needs doing. She waited. I think that goes both ways, he said, giving it and taking it. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was the calibrated one, measuring, taking in information, filing it. But underneath it something else, something that didn't get filed, that stayed. You've already decided, she said. I think so, he said. She nodded once, picked up her cup. Then when he comes, you'll know what to do. Garrett Sloan came to Blackstone Ridge on the 21st of December. He came alone, which Rowan had not expected. No Decker, no Marsh, no careful positioning for an audience. Just Sloan on a horse that was working too hard in the cold, coming up the drive in the early afternoon with his hat pulled low and his coat collar up, and nothing in his manner that resembled the man who had performed at every valley gathering for 30 years. He dismounted slowly. His age showed in it, in a way it usually didn't. Rowan was on the porch when he arrived. He'd been expecting this for 2 days and had decided to wait outside rather than make Sloan knock. Knocking, somehow, seemed like an unnecessary cruelty. Sloan stopped at the base of the porch steps. He looked up at Rowan. He had the face of a man who has rehearsed something and knows the rehearsal wasn't adequate. I heard you've been pooling with the other ranchers, Sloan said. That's right. Hay, feed, night watch rotation. Sloan looked at the barn. Your operation's holding. It's holding, Rowan said. A silence. The wind moved between them. I've had some losses, Sloan said. I heard. Another silence. Sloan's jaw worked once. He was a man who had spent 58 years not asking for things, and the machinery for it was not well oiled. I've got 40 head with nowhere to shelter, Sloan said. My remaining barn can't take them through another hard week. If I lose them... He stopped. He looked at Rowan directly, and there was nothing performative in his face now, none of the careful social management. Just a man looking at the gap between what he'd believed and what turned out to be true. I'd be finished by spring. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. He thought about every specific thing Garrett Sloan had done since October. He went through the list deliberately, not to work himself up, but to look at it honestly, because what he decided next deserved honest accounting. The feed store. The wire order. The visit to Naomi while he was on the range. The letter from Kansas. The small, impatient, and calculated campaign to isolate and exhaust a man who Sloan had decided was already beaten. He thought about all of it. Then he stepped back and opened the door. Come inside, he said. Naomi's got coffee on. Sloan stood at the bottom of the steps. Something crossed his face that Rowan didn't have a name for exactly. Not surprised, because Sloan was too controlled for that to show purely, but something in the vicinity of it. Something that looked like a man recalculating in real time. You'd... Sloan started. Stopped. I'd what? Rowan said. Not unkindly, genuinely asking. Sloan was quiet for a moment. You'd still help me, he said. After... I know what after, Rowan said. Come inside. Sloan came inside. He sat at the kitchen table where 2 months ago Rowan had sat alone with bad coffee and the specific silence of a man whose life had arranged itself around absence. And Naomi put a cup in front of him with the same undemonstrative efficiency she extended to everyone, without warmth or coldness, just the thing that needed doing, done. Sloan sat with both hands around the cup, which was something Rowan recognized. They talked for an hour. By the end of it, Sloan's 40 head were going to winter in Blackstone Ridge's secondary pasture alongside Rowan's own cattle, and Sloan would work 3 days a week through January helping with the work he was adding by being there, and in spring there would be an accounting that they'd figure out then. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Rowan wasn't built for the kind of forgiveness that required a scene. It was more like a decision to proceed, a choice to move in the direction of what was needed rather than what was owed. When Sloan left, Eli was in the doorway of the back hall. Rowan wasn't sure how long he'd been there. You let him in, Eli said. I did. After everything. After everything, Rowan said. Eli leaned against the doorframe. He had the horse's brush in his hand. He'd been in the barn before Sloan arrived and had come in sometime during the conversation. His face was working through something complicated. My mom would say that's the right thing, he said. What do you say? Rowan said. Eli thought about it. The honest way he thought about everything, without rushing to a conclusion. I think it probably is, he said. I just don't know if I would have done it. You might have, Rowan said. You're your father's son. Eli looked at him. For a moment, he was just a 14-year-old boy standing in a hallway with a horse brush, carrying more than 14 years' worth of things, and the weight of it showed. He would have liked you, Eli said finally. Rowan felt that land somewhere it wasn't going to move from. Go check on the mare, he said. She's been inside all day. Eli went, and Rowan stood in the kitchen that no longer felt empty and thought about a man who had been a good man but not a sturdy one, who had raised a son who was both, and about the strange paths that brought the right people to the places that needed them, and about the cost of things and who paid it. He was still thinking about it when Naomi came back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and began preparations for dinner, moving through the small space with the efficiency that he'd stopped noticing as remarkable and started noticing as simply the particular shape of how she moved through the world. You all right? She said without turning around. Yeah, he said. She didn't push it. She never pushed it. She gave things room, the way she gave fragile systems room to grow. And he had come to understand that this was not lack of curiosity, but its own specific form of respect. He sat at the kitchen table in the middle of December on his struggling, holding, somehow still standing ranch, and he thought about spring, which was the first time in a very long while that he'd thought about spring as something to move toward rather than simply something to endure until it arrived. Outside the window, the valley lay in its white and difficult silence. Inside, the fire burned, and the kitchen was warm, and somewhere in the back of the barn, a boy was talking to a horse that was going to be fine. Sloane's 40 head settled into the secondary pasture without drama, which was more than anyone had expected. The cattle themselves didn't care whose brand they carried. They bunched together in the cold the way cattle always did, without politics, without history, finding warmth in proximity, the way living things do when the alternative is freezing. Rowan watched them merge with his own herd on the second morning and thought there was probably a lesson in that, though he wasn't the type to stand in a frozen pasture extracting lessons from livestock behavior when there was work to do. Sloane came 3 days a week as agreed. He was not easy company and made no effort to be. He worked without conversation, which Rowan found he didn't mind. A man who worked quietly and well was easier than a man who talked. What was harder to ignore was the way Sloane moved through the ranch, with the particular stiffness of someone who is aware, at every moment, of exactly where he is and why, and finds it costly. He was a proud man doing a humble thing, and the friction of it showed in his jaw and his shoulders and the way he never quite looked directly at the barn that wasn't his. Rowan didn't make anything of it. He gave instructions when instructions were needed and left Sloane to his own interior weather the rest of the time. It was Naomi who made the first real crack in it, which surprised exactly nobody who had been paying attention. She did it the way she did most things, without announcing it. Sloane had been working the east pasture for about 3 weeks when she started leaving a plate for him at the kitchen table alongside everyone else's, not asking if he wanted it, just putting it there. The first time, Sloane stood at the door and looked at the plate with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling on a careful neutrality. He sat down and ate. He said thank you when he was done, to the room rather than to anyone specifically, and went back out. Naomi said nothing. Finn said, with complete sincerity, he eats fast, and Hazel said, shh, and that was the entire event. But he kept sitting down. Every work day, when lunch came, Sloane sat at the table that he had spent 4 months trying to undermine the foundation of, and ate what the woman he had tried to run off put in front of him, and said thank you to the room, and went back out. It didn't become warm. It didn't become a friendship. But it became a fact, and facts, in Rowan's experience, were more durable than feelings. January was hard the way only January in Wyoming can be hard, with a total commitment to the project, as though the cold had decided this was its life's work and intended to see it through. The cooperative arrangement with the neighboring ranches was the thing that made the difference, though none of them would have called it that at the time. At the time it was just, whose pasture had the best windbreak this week, whose hay was running lower, who could spare a man for 2 days and needed one in return. The bookkeeping of survival, done without ceremony. Hazel kept the actual books. This had happened gradually, then suddenly, the way most things happened at Blackstone Ridge. She'd started writing things down in her notebook. Then she'd started cross-referencing. Then Rowan had looked over her shoulder one evening and found that she'd created a supply ledger that covered not just Blackstone Ridge, but all 4 cooperating ranches, with current inventories and projected consumption rates, and deficit warnings written in her careful hand in pencil, with dates. "When did you do this?" he said. "Over the last few weeks," Hazel said. "At night, mostly." "You've been getting information from the other ranches?" "I asked Eli to ask when he was over there. And Mrs. Timmons told me some things when she visited." She looked at the ledger. "Henderson's North Storage is going to run short by February 10th if they don't adjust consumption. I wrote them a note, but I wasn't sure if I should send it without asking you." Rowan looked at the note. It was polite and precise and contained exactly the information needed and nothing extra. "Send it," he said. She sent it. Henderson adjusted. He sent back a note that said, "With the terse economy of a man who is not accustomed to corresponding with 10-year-olds. Good catch. Thank you." Hazel kept this note in her notebook between 2 pages and did not mention it again, but Rowan noticed she stood slightly straighter for the rest of that week. February brought its own particular cruelty in the form of a sickness that moved through the valley the way sickness moved in winter, opportunistically, finding the tired and the cold and the people who had been running on not enough sleep for too many weeks. It started with Finn. He came to breakfast one morning and didn't eat, which was so contrary to his nature that Naomi had her hand on his forehead before he'd finished sitting down. Fever. Not dangerous, initially, but enough to put him in bed, which Finn found philosophically objectionable and expressed at length until the fever climbed high enough that arguing required more energy than he had. Then it moved to Hazel. Then to one of the Henderson boys who'd been working alongside Eli. Then, by the second week of February, it had visited most of the cooperating households in some form. Rowan did not get sick. He had the constitution of someone who had been refusing to get sick for 9 years through sheer bloody-mindedness, and had apparently made it a habit. But he watched the ranch and the cooperative arrangement continue to function at reduced capacity during those 2 weeks. And what he saw was the thing that no valley meeting had ever produced. People who were genuinely sick themselves sending whoever they could spare to cover whoever was sicker, without counting the cost, because the system only worked if everyone kept it working. Naomi got sick on the 9th day. She didn't tell anyone. She just kept doing what she did, but slower, and with a gray quality to her face that Rowan noticed on the 2nd day and should have noticed on the 1st. He noticed it because he'd been paying close attention to her face for 4 months, which was a fact he was aware of and hadn't yet decided what to do with. "You're sick," he said on the 2nd day. "I'm fine," she said. She was making bread, which in her hierarchy of tasks was non-negotiable regardless of circumstance. "You're not fine, you're—" He paused. He didn't have a word for what she looked like that wasn't either clinical or too much the other thing. "You should sit down." "The bread needs another 10 minutes. I can watch bread." She looked at him with the specific expression of a woman who has been managing everything for everyone for so long that the suggestion she might not need to is not immediately parsable as something real. "I know how to watch bread," he said. "It's bread. I've watched bread before." "When?" "A long time ago." He moved to the stove and picked up the cloth she'd been using, and she let him, which told him more about how she was feeling than any admission would have. "Go sit." She sat. She sat in the chair at the kitchen table that had become, over 4 months, specifically her chair, in the particular way that furniture becomes associated with a person, not claimed, just understood. And she put her elbows on the table and her face in her hands for a moment, and Rowan watched the bread and said nothing because some moments needed to be left alone. After a while she said, muffled by her hands, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Stop." She looked up. Her eyes were tired in the specific way that goes past the body and gets into something deeper. "I've been moving for 2 years. Since Thomas died, I don't know how to just stop and let someone else.